Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a flickering candlelit chamber somewhere inside a 14th century castle. The air smells faintly of lavender water, beeswax, and milk gone just a touch too warm. You hear the rustle of linen as a woman in plain wool shifts her weight beside a golden cradle. She's not the queen, but she holds the royal heir in her arms. Nearby, a parchment contract lies on a table, sealed in red wax and heavy with promises, loyalty, secrecy, and silence. A noble, wet nurse's life was part blessing, part trap. She could nurse a future monarch, or lose everything at the first rumor of disloyalty. You might think this sounds like a sweet, sleepy nursery story, but if you were born into this job, you probably wouldn't survive it past the gossip. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop a comment with your location and the local time. Let's see how wide our little sleepy crew has stretched across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing, or rather, swaying sleepily, in a chamber so large that even your thoughts echo. A tapestry of hunting dogs flutters in the draft, and the faint scent of beeswax and boiled linen hangs in the air. The stone walls glisten with damp, and from the corner, a cradle creaks as a nursemaid rocks it with the absent-minded rhythm of someone who's done this 1,000 times. Congratulations. You're a newly made medieval parent, or rather, a medieval noble parent. Which means, of course, that your first parental act is to hand your baby to someone else entirely. The child, let's say he's called something appropriately medieval, like Godfrey the Slightly Damp, squeaks in protest as he's bundled into silks. His hair, what little there is of it, smells faintly of rosewater and goat milk. You've done your duty, produced an heir who will, with luck, outlive a candle flame. And now you're told, it's time to rest. Rest, because apparently it's unbecoming for someone of your status to do anything so undignified as nurse a baby. A maid, curtsying so deeply she nearly disappears into her own apron, murmurs something about finding the wet nurse. You nod, pretending this is all perfectly natural, though somewhere in the back of your mind, you're wondering how your own mother handled this. Probably the same way. Maybe she never touched you until you could hold a spoon. Medieval noble parenting was, at its core, a complex performance of class, hygiene anxiety, and social hierarchy. It was less about raising a child and more about maintaining a dynasty, while keeping one's wardrobe free of milk stains. A noble woman's body was, after all, considered far too valuable for practical use. Nursing was for those whose bodies could be employed, contracted, and, if necessary, replaced. You can almost hear the reasoning echoing through the corridors of history. But milady, if you nurse your own child, you'll delay your next pregnancy. Because the body's natural pause between births, something modern biology calls lactational amenorrhea, was not merely an inconvenience to noble dynasties. It was a political risk. The fewer heirs, the shakier the line. So noble women were encouraged to outsource motherhood, in the most literal sense, to the nearest suitably milky candidate. Some chroniclers, with the dry amusement of men who never had to lactate, wrote of these arrangements with approval. It is unfit, wrote one 15th century cleric, for noble ladies to nurse, for their bodies are dedicated to the continuation of lineage, not to the animal act of feeding. You might roll your eyes, but perhaps you're too tired to argue. You've just given birth in a drafty castle, and no one's invented central heating or maternity leave. Outside, a midwife argues with a steward about the proper way to sterilize a feeding cloth. Spoiler: There is no proper way. The best you can hope for is rinsing in wine or vinegar, both of which double as medicine and disinfectant. You can already hear the baby crying again, a mewling sound that cuts through the murmur of servants. But you're told not to worry. Your duty is to heal, rest, and resume looking noble. The door opens, and in comes a woman in a faded wool gown. She curtsies low, the hem of her skirt whispering against the floor. Her hands are strong, her face weathered, and there's a faint scent of barley porridge about her. This, apparently, is your wet nurse. She is both everything you are not allowed to be, earthy, maternal, endlessly practical, and everything your child will depend on. You nod politely, pretending this doesn't feel strange, as if motherhood were an office you could delegate. Somewhere between awkward gratitude and mild suspicion, a ritual exchange begins. She is asked about her health, her morals, her husband, if she has one, and how recently she gave birth. There's even a discreet examination of her milk. Yes, someone actually squeezes a drop into a dish, observes its color, and pronounces judgment. If it's too watery, too thick, or heaven forbid, bluish, she may be dismissed on the spot. Milk, in the medieval mind, was not just nourishment. It was character, morality, even soul, condensed into liquid form. So you stand there, watching as this stranger takes your baby, lifts him with the ease of someone who's done this before, and begins to feed him. The room quiets, the fire pops, and for a moment, all your anxieties about dynastic survival melt into the simple, rhythmic sound of a child suckling contentedly. Of course, that peace won't last. Already the court whispers are brewing. Some noble aunt will tisk about, allowing a commoner such intimacy, while a cleric will frown and warn that the child may inherit her temperament. Medieval thinkers believed that milk carried not just nutrients but moral essence. The nurse's virtue, or lack thereof, could shape the child's destiny. Hence the obsession with finding a woman of impeccable morals, as if goodness could be transmitted through the breast like a sermon in liquid form. You look again at your baby, now half asleep, cheeks round and glistening. He looks peaceful, though you can't help but feel a twinge of displacement. He knows her warmth, not yours. He'll grow up calling you my lady, not mother. You remind yourself this is how it's done. Everyone does it this way. You're preserving your role, your beauty, your lineage. But the human heart has always been a bit stubborn about following the rule book. You feel something tug quietly, like a thread catching an embroidery. Maybe it's pride, maybe guilt, or maybe it's just the distant memory of having been a baby once, fed by someone else's hands while your own mother looked on. A chill wind moves through the nursery, rattling a pewter cup on the table. You draw your cloak tighter. Tomorrow, there will be a formal ceremony, a small feast even, to celebrate the nurse's appointment. There will be signatures, witnesses, and perhaps a toast to the milk of loyalty. For tonight, you simply listen to the soft breaths, to the slow crackle of firewood, and to the sound of your own heartbeat, steady as the turning of time. And as you drift into your first uneasy sleep as a medieval parent, you understand dimly that this peculiar arrangement, the noble mother and her humble surrogate, is about to shape not just one childhood, but the rhythm of royal life for centuries to come. By morning, the nursery smells faintly of warm milk and damp wool, the universal perfume of early parenthood. Servants tiptoe like conspirators, keeping their voices hushed in reverence, or perhaps fear, of waking the new heir. You, on the other hand, are not supposed to be here at all. A duchess, a countess, a noble lady, take your pick, has no business in the nursery except for ceremonial appearances. Your chamber is 2 floors above, where the curtains are velvet, the sheets perfumed, and the conversation considerably less sticky. Still, you linger. Something about watching your baby sleep, his tiny hand twitching as if grasping a dream, makes you forget that your presence here is mildly scandalous. After all, what if someone saw you rocking your own child? They might think you care. And caring in your circle is dangerous. Caring suggests emotion, and emotion, especially maternal emotion, was an unpredictable thing in a world built on alliances and titles. Medieval nobles had a talent for outsourcing intimacy, marriages arranged, children fostered, faith delegated to confessors, and now milk delegated to women who signed binding contracts about how to love your child just enough. It wasn't always meant to be cold, you remind yourself. The logic behind noble non-nursing was, at least on paper, sound. If you breastfed, your fertility paused. The church and the midwives both knew this, though for entirely different reasons. The priests called it God's natural spacing of births, while physicians described it in terms of bodily humors. Too much milk diverted from the womb could cool the reproductive system, delaying conception. Either way, for noble families, this was unacceptable. A lord's lineage depended on quantity as much as quality. The more heirs, the safer the inheritance. So your body was to be kept, quite literally, available for duty. It's almost comical, you think, that in a world obsessed with bloodlines, milk lines were considered a logistical inconvenience. But in the polished mirror of aristocratic reasoning, this made sense. A noble woman was the vessel of dynasty, not its caretaker. Her role was to produce heirs, not feed them. Her body was sacred property of her husband, her family, her title. The idea of using it for something as ordinary as nursing seemed to border on indecent. And yet, underneath the sermons and pseudoscience, something more delicate lurked. Decorum. It was not just biology, it was image. To nurse was to be seen doing something bodily, human, peasant-like, and nothing terrified the nobility quite like being mistaken for peasants. In the courts of France and England, the notion of a noblewoman nursing her child herself was viewed with the same raised eyebrows one might reserve for someone eating stew with their hands at a royal banquet. There were exceptions, of course, occasional tales of duchesses so devoted that they insisted on feeding their infants personally, but these stories were treated as saintly curiosities, not habits to emulate. You recall a bit of gossip your steward shared? That when Eleanor of Aquitaine reportedly nursed one of her children briefly, chroniclers called her act a rare indulgence of motherly fondness. A compliment, yes, but one dripping with faint disapproval, as though affection itself were unbecoming of nobility. And so, your baby's nurse becomes not just a helper, but a mirror of your virtue. Her conduct reflects upon your house. If she behaves modestly, the child's upbringing will be praised. If she gossips, flirts, or, heaven forbid, dies unexpectedly, it becomes a moral commentary on your judgment. The arrangement is precarious, like balancing a candle on the edge of a tapestry. One wrong move and the whole nursery goes up in smoke. Meanwhile, the moralists of the day were busy making things worse. Churchmen, always eager to supervise the most private aspects of life, began issuing sermons about the proper virtues of wet nurses. They warned that hiring a woman of poor character could infect a child's soul through her milk. Some even claimed that babies nursed by women prone to anger or lust would grow up violent or adulterous, absorbing vices the way they absorbed nutrients. It would be funny if it weren't so earnestly recorded. A 13th century theologian named Thomas of Cantimpré wrote that a nurse's temperament imprints itself upon the spirit of the infant. Another insisted that only women who were chaste, devout, and of mild disposition should be permitted to nurse noble children. One can almost imagine a medieval job interview involving not only a taste test, but a confession. This belief in moral milk went deep. Medical texts argued that breast milk was a refinement of blood. Literally, blood transformed by maternal virtue. A corrupt woman's blood, therefore, produced corrupt milk. It was a strange mix of biology and theology, lactation as both physiology and spiritual alchemy. The result was an entire profession built on the illusion that purity could be measured in ounces. And so, noble parents like you found yourselves in a bureaucratic maze of ethics and logistics. Finding a wet nurse was like hiring a royal ambassador. The wrong choice could stain the family's reputation. Some families insisted on noble-born nurses, widows or impoverished gentlewomen, believing that rank would purify milk, though not everyone agreed. Others preferred robust peasants from the countryside, reasoning that hearty milk came from hearty labor. But class anxiety seeped into everything. Too noble, and she might feel entitled. Too lowly, and she might carry animal humors. The perfect wet nurse was imagined as morally luminous, physically sturdy, and socially invisible, a unicorn in a linen wimple. Meanwhile, your own life resumes its ceremonial rhythm. You attend Mass, receive visitors, and accept congratulations from ladies who politely ignore the existence of the woman actually raising your child. You send token gifts to the nurse, a shawl here, a silver clasp there, but only through intermediaries. It would be unseemly to show too much gratitude. Yet, occasionally, you catch yourself wondering what your baby smells like after feeding, whether his cheeks flush the same way yours do, whether he turns toward your voice even when you're not in the room. You're not supposed to ask such questions. You're supposed to believe in the machinery of rank, to trust that affection can be subcontracted, that love is not part of the job description. But somewhere behind all the tapestries and theology, in the quiet hum of the nursery, a different truth is taking shape. The bond forming between your child and the woman who feeds him is stronger than any parchment contract. It's made of skin and sound and scent, things no decree can regulate. You might not admit it aloud, but in your heart you sense the irony. For all your careful control, the most intimate act of your child's life now belongs to someone else. And perhaps that is the true royal problem. Not decorum, not fertility, not class, but the silent exchange of tenderness that no title can quite command. The baby stirs, sighs, and returns to sleep. The candle guttering beside you trembles, its wax pooling like spilled moonlight. You take one last look and step away, your footsteps muffled by thick rush mats, leaving the room, and the soft sound of milk-drunk contentment behind. By the second week, word spreads faster than candle smoke. The castle is hiring. Not for a jester or a cook this time, but for something far more critical, someone to feed the air. The announcement ripples through nearby villages like a rumor wrapped in gold. "They're looking for a wet nurse," whispers one miller's wife to another, "and they're paying more than a knight earns in a year." And just like that, a quiet parade begins. Women arrive at the gates with infants in arms, shawls pulled tight, eyes half hopeful, half fearful. Some have lost their own babies and still carry milk. Others come with twins, reasoning that they can spare one breast for royal duty. A few are shepherded in by ambitious husbands who smell opportunity and possibly steady coin. It's a strange kind of job fair, the medieval version of corporate recruitment, except the HR department is your steward and the job description begins with, "must be lactating." From your vantage point, safely removed naturally, you watch the selection unfold like theater. Your steward, Sir Geoffrey, is a man of order and lists. He reads the criteria aloud to a scribe: healthy complexion, moderate figure, clean habits, faithful temperament, and a husband preferably not prone to rebellion or heresy. In short, someone who won't cause trouble and won't die before the baby is weaned. Behind the formality, though, lies an undercurrent of superstition. Medieval minds loved to blend practicality with cosmic logic. A woman's milk wasn't just judged by color or quantity, but by astrological timing. Was her child born under a favorable planet? Did her stars align with the baby's? Could her milk, heaven forbid, carry the influence of Mars or Saturn? You've heard old midwives swear that milk drawn during an eclipse could curse a child with restlessness. Another claimed that a nurse born under Aquarius produced watery children, prone to melancholy. The steward, fortunately, is less poetic. He checks teeth, posture, and pulse, though how much he understands of any of it is debatable. Still, these inspections matter. One chronicler describes a duke's household sending emissaries to inspect over 24 candidates, even requiring testimonials from parish priests. Another noble family in Florence reportedly demanded letters confirming that each candidate's husband was faithful, as if fidelity could be notarized. The women line up in the courtyard. Some cradle their infants, others, whose own babies have died, hold folded linens against their chests, as though to keep the ache at bay. The steward nods to the castle physician, a thin man whose robe smells faintly of vinegar and herbs. He carries a small silver spoon, the tool of judgment. One by one, he requests a drop of milk, tests it on his tongue like a sommelier evaluating wine. "Too thin," he murmurs of one. "Too sweet," of another. He pauses over one candidate and nods approvingly. Milk, in the medieval mind, wasn't a simple bodily fluid. It was the essence of the humors, the byproduct of perfect blood transformed by maternal virtue. The right milk was white, slightly sweet, and produced by a woman of mild temper. The wrong milk, too yellow, too watery, too sharp, was a sign of corrupted blood, moral laxity, or, occasionally, witchcraft. You listen as the steward mutters, "We'll need one who eats properly. No onions, no garlic, no sour wine. Her diet shapes the child's disposition." He's not entirely wrong. Diet does affect milk, but the medieval interpretation leans more toward theology than nutrition. Garlic, they believed, caused infants to grow coarse. Onions made them cry too easily. Pork made them lazy. Imagine writing all that into a royal job posting. A woman steps forward, strong shoulders, calm eyes, a baby on her hip. Her name is Agnes. She lost her husband to a quarry accident, and her child, barely 2 months old, nurses drowsily. When asked her parish, she answers softly, "St. Mildred's." When asked her sins, she crosses herself and replies, "I've confessed them, my lord." The steward glances at you for silent approval, though technically, you're not supposed to give any. Still, you nod. There's something steady about her. The physician takes a sample, holds it up to the light slanting through the courtyard arch, and declares it wholesome. He records the finding in a neat Latin note that will be sealed with wax before she ever sets foot in the nursery. It all feels absurdly bureaucratic, but there's a strange comfort in the ceremony, as if milk itself required paperwork to be respectable. contracts will follow. Oaths will be sworn. Witnesses summoned. You realize that motherhood, in your world, has become a legal transaction, complete with clauses and penalties. And yet, for all the rules, there's still a touch of mystery. As you watch the chosen nurse cradle her own baby, you see something quietly powerful. The rhythm of her body aligning to another's hunger, the way her voice softens without thinking. It's not ceremony, not theology, it's survival. You can almost feel the warmth of it radiating across the courtyard, as though life itself hums in her veins. Later that evening, you overhear servants gossiping by the kitchen hearth. They say the lady's new nurse was chosen under a good moon, one says. Her milk will make the boy clever. Another chimes in. Or cunning. Depends which stars were rising. You smile faintly into your cup. For all the superstition, you can't deny the poetry of it. Milk tied to moonlight, virtue to nourishment, destiny to diet. In a world without modern science, people filled the gaps with imagination. And maybe, you think, there's something oddly comforting in that. By nightfall, the choice is made. Agnes will stay in the castle. Her own child will be cared for by relatives. A bittersweet trade, but one that promises stability and silver coin. Tomorrow, she'll be washed, robed, and sworn into service in the chapel before witnesses. The priest will bless her breasts with holy water and prayer, declaring her milk pure and obedient to God's design. You try not to laugh at the phrase, but as you walk past the nursery door, you hear the faint sound of her humming. A low, steady tune, half lullaby, half prayer, and you realize, with a pang you didn't expect, that your baby will fall asleep to that voice, not yours. You pause outside, listening until the song fades into the crackle of the fire. It's oddly peaceful, like listening to history breathing. Somewhere in that sound lies the oldest truth of parenting, that love, like milk, finds its way where it's needed, regardless of titles, contracts, or propriety. Morning light slants through narrow glass panes, fractured by lead-like lines on an old palm. You've dressed for the occasion, though you're not sure why. A velvet robe for a ritual that involves milk. The chapel below hums with the small bustle of officialdom. The priest in his vestments, the steward with his ledger, the physician polishing his spectacles, and the new wet nurse standing awkwardly at the center of it all. This, apparently, is the inspection, the final test before the royal contract. And you, for reasons both symbolic and social, are here to witness it. Agnes looks nervous but composed, a thin silver cross glinting at her throat. Her hands clasp and unclasp. The priest begins by reading a blessing in Latin, his voice echoing through the cold air. Something about purity, duty, and divine order. Words that make the whole thing sound less like employment and more like a consecration. Which, in a way, it is. The wet nurse's body has become a kind of holy instrument. Her milk is no longer hers alone, but property of the lineage. She is entering a contract that, for all its piety, is astonishingly specific. You glance at the document, a parchment written in fine, fussy script. It outlines everything. Her diet, her behavior, her sleep schedule, even her emotional life. She must avoid anger, grief, and excessive laughter, the steward reads. Her spirit should remain moderate, lest they disturb the humors of the milk. You nearly snort. Moderate laughter. It's a wonder anyone survived the Middle Ages without dying of irony. The contract continues. She may not eat garlic or onions, nor drink strong ale. She must bathe weekly, pray daily, and keep her own child in good health so that her milk remains fresh. She may not nurse any other infant, not even her own, unless granted permission. Her breasts, officially, are under royal management. There's even a clause about language. She must speak softly in the nursery and never curse, lest the infant learn corrupt words by hearing. You imagine a 2-month-old blurting medieval profanity and have to look away before you laugh aloud. Yet beneath the absurdity lies a quiet seriousness. In a world without pasteurization, sterilization, or pediatricians, the health of an heir depended entirely on the woman standing before you. The rules may be archaic, but they're born of fear, the constant medieval awareness that life is fragile, that infants die, that lineage can vanish in a cough or a fever. The physician now steps forward, holding what looks alarmingly like a small brass funnel. He explains that he will perform a medical examination. You resist the urge to flee. He checks her pulse, her gums, her eyes, even her breath, all indicators of health according to the ancient humoral theory. Then, with utmost ceremony, he tests the milk again. A drop on the tongue, a nod of approval. Balanced, he declares, neither too choleric nor too phlegmatic. You wonder what that even means. Evidently, medieval medicine divided the world and the body into 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good milk was a sign of harmony, bad milk an omen of imbalance. Agnes passes every test. The priest blesses her hands with a small bowl of water and sprinkles the cradle for good measure. The steward affixes his seal, presses a ribbon into wax, and the contract becomes official. She curtsies, visibly relieved, and you, ever the noble observer, nod your approval with regal calm. But somewhere inside, you feel a peculiar discomfort. Not revulsion, exactly. Something subtler. A recognition that what you've just witnessed is both profoundly human and profoundly transactional. This woman has sold her nurture, her body's quiet rhythm, in exchange for security. And you have bought peace of mind with her flesh and devotion. The priest closes the ceremony with a prayer so long that even the statues look bored. May her milk nourish wisdom and piety. He drones. May no shadow of temptation disturb her heart. The implication, of course, is that temptation lurks everywhere, and that even lactation can be morally suspicious. Indeed, the Church's anxiety about women's bodies could fill entire libraries. Some clerics wrote tracts warning that wet nurses might harbor lustful thoughts while nursing, thus transmitting impurity through milk. Others insisted that milk, being transmuted blood, linked the child spiritually to the nurse, hence the rule that she should be morally pure, so the infant's soul would not, as one sermon claimed, suckle corruption. You can't help imagining some hapless friar, hunched over parchment, trying to explain this metaphysical milk exchange in Latin. There's something both ridiculous and touching about it. A civilization trying so hard to make sense of love, nurture, and biology with the tools of theology. After the ceremony, Agnes is escorted to her new quarters, a modest chamber adjacent to the nursery, furnished with a straw bed, a stool, and a small chest for her things. It's not luxurious, but it's warm and safe. A rare privilege. Her own baby will be sent to her sister's care in the village, a separation she accepts with quiet grace. Perhaps she tells herself that this is for both their sakes, her child's future secured by the coin she'll earn here. Later, when you visit discreetly, she stands by the cradle, humming that same low tune. The baby, your baby, feeds contentedly, eyes fluttering like candle flames. Agnes looks up, startled, then bows. "Milady," she murmurs. You study her face, the lines of fatigue, the calm beneath it. She has the air of someone who's been both blessed and bound. You almost want to apologize, though you're not sure for what. For the contract, for the imbalance, for the quiet unfairness of it all. But instead, you smile and tell her she's doing well. She nods, then adds, "He's strong, this one. Drinks like a prince." You laugh softly. Let's hope he learns moderation sooner than his father did. Her mouth twitches, the faintest trace of humor. For a fleeting moment, you're equals. Two mothers, divided by rank, joined by sleeplessness and a baby's hunger. The candle between you wavers, sending twin shadows across the cradle. You think absurdly that this whole ritual, with its seals and oaths, has been nothing more than society's attempt to put structure around something ancient and wordless, the act of feeding another human being. In the end, the church, the stewards, the scribes, they're all trying to contain the same mystery, the way nurture creates kinship, the way milk, of all things, can blur the boundaries of class and soul. Outside, the chapel bell tolls the hour. The priest gathers his papers, the steward closes his ledger, and the castle resumes its daily rhythm. A rhythm that now includes the quiet, steady heartbeat of a woman nursing a royal child in a borrowed room. You retreat to your own chamber, half amused, half haunted. Tomorrow, there will be feasts and letters and petitions. But tonight, there is only the thought of that humble ritual, the so-called inspection, and how it felt, for one brief moment, more sacred than any coronation. By now, the royal nursery has its chosen wet nurse, a woman of calm demeanor and acceptable moral hygiene, whose breasts have been whispered about approvingly in the servants' quarters. But before she's allowed to hold your precious heir, there's paperwork. So much paperwork, in fact, that you begin to suspect the medieval nobility invented bureaucracy as a kind of emotional armor. The royal wet nurse's contract is no simple agreement. It is a sprawling document, sometimes several parchment pages long, stamped, sealed, and read aloud by a clerk who looks as though he hasn't smiled since the last crusade. It begins with all the flowery flattery one expects of the age. To the most gracious and nourishing servant of our Lord's chosen child, but soon descends into an obsessive list of don'ts, won'ts, and must-nots. You are told that the wet nurse may not leave the castle without written permission. She may not engage in gossip. She may not fall in love. She may not even, under certain royal households, eat onions, lest their smell offend the delicate nose of the baby prince. The logic of medieval parenting is equal parts tenderness and paranoia. The contract stipulates her diet in meticulous detail. She is to consume wholesome foods, fresh bread, honeyed water, lamb, greens, and nothing too melancholy. No sour wine, no old cheese, no bitter herbs. Some contracts even forbid beans, which were believed to cause flatulent humors, and therefore distemper of the milk. Imagine the court physician, quill in hand, debating the moral integrity of legumes. Next comes the clause on behavior. She must attend Mass daily and avoid vain amusements, which likely meant anything remotely fun. No tavern singing, no public dancing, no gambling with stable hands. The contract may as well have read, "Kindly refrain from being human." Her social conduct is also scrutinized. She must not accept gifts without permission. She must not visit her own family too frequently. In certain courts, such as those of France and Burgundy, she might even be prohibited from nursing any other child during her tenure. The baby's milk, after all, was sacred and must not be diluted by affection for peasant offspring. If the child fell ill, the wet nurse could be accused of everything from negligence to witchcraft. Some clauses declared that if the infant died under her nourishment, she would forfeit her salary and possibly her freedom. One might say that medieval motherhood, by blood or by contract, was a career with poor job security. The contract ceremonies themselves were often oddly theatrical. Witnesses stood by as the nurse pressed her hand to a gospel book or swore before a relic, sometimes of the Virgin Mary, who, naturally, was considered the ultimate mother. The symbolism was unmistakable. She was entering not merely a job, but a sacred duty. It was a kind of holy employment with a threat of divine HR oversight. In some Italian courts, these agreements were written in both Latin and the vernacular, so there'd be no confusion about the terms. Every stipulation, from the feeding schedule to the frequency of bathing, was set in ink. The wet nurse became a contractual extension of the royal womb, her body a legal entity of the crown. And of course, the pay reflected this peculiar status. While most peasants might earn a few pence a week, a royal wet nurse could make the equivalent of a minor knight's income, plus food, housing, and sometimes fine clothing. Her milk was not just nourishment, it was a commodity, a status symbol. It flowed, quite literally, through the veins of politics. But the best part, the part that really drives home the absurdity of it all, is that the mother who commissioned this contract might never even read it. Noble women were often too busy recovering from childbirth or pretending not to notice their babies had been outsourced. So it fell to secretaries and confessors to manage the whole arrangement, as though child rearing were just another piece of estate administration. You can picture the scene: a clerk dripping wax onto parchment, a priest muttering blessings, a wet nurse kneeling awkwardly, aware that everyone in the room has strong opinions about her chest. It's the strangest job orientation in history. And yet, amid the pomp and suspicion, a strange tenderness seeps through. There's always a moment, recorded in a few scattered letters, when a noble mother meets her baby's new caretaker and says something kind, something vulnerable. Perhaps she thanks her. Perhaps she doesn't. But in that quiet moment between two women, separated by class yet united by biology, you glimpse the fragile humanity beneath the contracts and titles. Some scholars argue that these contracts, rigid as they seem, were also forms of protection. They guaranteed payment, housing, and often a nurse's safety, something few medieval women could count on. Others, less charitable, call them early examples of reproductive labor exploitation. The truth, as always, is probably both, a blend of gratitude and control, affection and anxiety. For the child, of course, none of this mattered. The baby would grow up believing that this calm, warm-voiced woman was simply mother. Royal portraits sometimes even include a beloved wet nurse in the background, unacknowledged by name, but immortalized in paint. She stands there, anonymous, her soft hands folded, her role sealed by ink and milk. As you drift deeper into this candlelit bureaucracy, you can almost hear the scratch of the quill across parchment, the faint hiss of sealing wax, the flutter of paper as it dries. Somewhere nearby, a cradle creaks, and the baby sighs in its sleep, utterly unaware that its comfort depends on a dozen clauses and signatures. And you, the imaginary noble observer, are beginning to feel that same heavy warmth that comes from both candlelight and comprehension. The deeper you understand the absurdity of medieval parenting, the more you feel its sleepy rhythm. formality wrapping tenderness like swaddling cloth. You exhale. The candle gutters, the ink dries, and the royal contract, now sealed and stored, becomes just another artifact of human insecurity, a promise made in milk and fear to keep one small heartbeat alive. The ink is dry, the seal is stamped, and now the wet nurse, contract in hand, baby at breast, takes her place in the quiet theater of royal infancy. Welcome to the nursery wing, a place that smells faintly of beeswax, rosewater, and the philosophical exhaustion of everyone inside it. You might expect a nursery to be a place of serenity, the medieval equivalent of a lullaby made of velvet curtains and gentle harp music. But in truth, this wing of the castle hums like a beehive. Not loud, never loud, but constant. Every breath, every creak of the cradle, every whispered prayer over a milk-soaked bib is part of a system as political as any royal court. You see, the nursery is not separate from power. It is its prototype. Inside these warm, dimly lit chambers, hierarchy is learned before speech. Every maid, every attendant, every nurse knows precisely how to curtsy, how to address the steward, how to step backward when the Duchess's shoes approach. Even the baby, tiny though he is, absorbs the rhythms of deference. His lullabies are sung to him in the language of obedience. The wet nurse, meanwhile, occupies an awkward place in this ecosystem. She is adored, resented, and monitored all at once. Her milk is life itself, but her presence also threatens the delicate illusion of noble self-sufficiency. Imagine the discomfort of a queen realizing that her child is more comforted by a servant's heartbeat than by her own. That kind of intimacy is dangerous. So the wet nurse's room is both close and distant, never too far from the child, but never within the main chambers of the noble mother. Her quarters are lined with soft cloth, toys carved from ivory or bone, and the faint traces of incense meant to disguise the smell of milk. In some courts, she even has her own small retinue, an assistant nurse, a laundress, and a cook, to prepare her diet exactly as prescribed by the contract. At first glance, it all seems benign, but beneath the hush of rocking chairs lies a steady undercurrent of courtly competition. The nursery is a microcosm of ambition. A good wet nurse, one whose royal charge grows plump, rosy, and charming, might find herself the subject of whispered praise in the great hall. Her Grace's nurse, they'll say, is touched by God's own mercy. And that sort of reputation, in a castle full of ladder climbers, is gold. Suddenly, everyone wants a word with her. A cousin of the Duke sends gifts for the child. A visiting bishop drops by to observe the progress of God's little servant. Even the steward starts appearing more often, inquiring politely if she's been eating well. It's all terribly flattering, until she realizes it's also surveillance disguised as concern. There's also the matter of influence, a word that in medieval society is as dangerous as plague. A wet nurse's words, murmured gently to a baby prince or princess, could one day echo in the corridors of power. Some royal historians, those nosy chroniclers who delighted in gossip, hint that the early temperaments of certain monarchs were shaped as much by milk as by monarchy. A nurse who sang soft songs of humility and patience might raise a merciful ruler. Another, who complained of injustice or muttered bitterness, might inadvertently plant the seeds of tyranny. Whether or not that's true doesn't matter. People believed it, and belief alone was enough to make the nursery a nest of whispers. Then there are the ladies-in-waiting, who flutter around like perfumed moths, pretending not to envy the wet nurse's proximity to the baby. They dab their eyes dramatically when the infant coos. then gossip viciously the moment the nurse leaves the room. Too familiar, they'll say. Too comfortable. The way she smiles at his grace, it's almost as if she forgets her place. And sometimes, in a way, she does. Not out of arrogance, but out of habit. When you cradle a child day and night, when your heartbeat becomes their lullaby, boundaries blur. There are records of noble women gently reprimanding their wet nurses for using affectionate nicknames or for holding the child too long after feeding. The logic is simple but cruel. Love is permitted, but not ownership. Meanwhile, in the corner, a scribe keeps notes of everything. Who entered the nursery, how long the feeding took, whether the baby sneezed. The medieval mind was obsessed with recording, observing, controlling. Even the act of burping an infant could, in the right court, become a topic for committee discussion. Yet despite the scrutiny, life in the nursery moves with a certain sleepy rhythm. The wet nurse hums softly, tracing the baby's cheek with her finger. A fire crackles. Somewhere beyond the walls, the sound of hooves echoes on cobblestones, the faint murmur of politics carrying through the halls. But here, time feels different, slower, sweeter, edged with milk and candlelight. The nurse whispers old folk rhymes, snippets of countryside lullabies that speak of rivers and wheat fields, and mothers waiting at doors. The baby's eyelids droop, flutter, and close. For a moment, the entire castle seems to pause, as if the tiny heartbeat of the future has lulled history itself to rest. But politics never really sleeps. Downstairs, courtiers are already speculating which noble family the child will marry, which alliances this fragile little life will cement. The irony is almost comical. The entire fate of kingdoms rests on a creature currently dribbling milk onto its embroidered bib. And in that absurdity lies something profoundly human. The wet nurse, for all her rules and restrictions, embodies the simple truth that empires are sustained by small acts of care. The power struggles, the scheming, the grand decrees. All of it depends, in the end, on whether one tired woman can soothe one cranky baby. So when she rocks the child through the night, eyes half closed, humming under her breath, she is, without knowing it, the quiet center of the political universe. Her lullabies are diplomacy, her patience, statecraft, her milk, legislation in liquid form. Outside, the wind sighs through the corridors. The guards change shifts. The candles flicker low. And in the nursery, history curls up and dreams, warm and full, unaware that kingdoms rise and fall beyond the reach of its tiny hand. The castle sleeps, or at least pretends to. Somewhere a minstrel is snoring into his lute, and a guard leans against a tapestry, dreaming of soup. But in the nursery wing, there is always one light that never truly goes out. You, the royal observer, half intrigued, half somnolent, can see it glowing like a low ember behind a carved wooden door. The wet nurse is awake again, humming to her nursling in a rhythm older than any dynasty. It is a scene that repeats night after night. She lifts the royal child, holds him close, and lets her warmth do what politics never can, soothe. And it's here, in this fragile glow of routine, that something both tender and perilous begins to take shape. Affection. Of course, the manuals, priests, and physicians of the age warned against this. Every contract, every sermon, every whisper of decorum was designed to prevent precisely what was now unfolding under a woolen blanket. Wet nurses were not supposed to love too much. They were to be calm, obedient, nurturing, but not devoted. And yet, how could they not be? Imagine it. You hold the same child every day for months. You feed him when he's hungry, rock him when he cries, murmur soft nonsense to chase away nightmares he doesn't yet understand. You hear his first laugh. You catch his first tooth. You watch his tiny fists curl around your finger, as if to say, "You are the whole world." How, exactly, is one supposed to draw the line between duty and love in that moment? But the medieval world, ever practical in its anxieties, had opinions. Scholars like Bartholomeus Anglicus, writing in the 13th century, warned that a wet nurse's emotions might imprint on the child. Her temperament, her joys, her angers, even her sins, were believed to seep into the baby through the milk itself. A cheerful nurse produced cheerful heirs, a melancholy one, rulers doomed to introspection. In short, the entire personality of a prince could be ruined by a bad mood and an unbalanced humoral system. So, mothers fretted. Confessors wrote long, droning letters about purity of heart. Physicians demanded milk samples for testing. All the while, real women simply did what women have always done, kept the baby alive, against the odds, in a world terrified of affection. There are letters scattered like breadcrumbs through medieval archives that give glimpses of these impossible relationships. In one from 14th century England, a countess thanks her child's former nurse for her care and gentle spirit and promises to remember her in every mass. In another, from the court of Naples, a grown nobleman writes fondly of his Balia, his milk mother, calling her the truest soul that ever loved me. You sense in those words something dangerous, a quiet rebellion against hierarchy, because love is leveling. A wet nurse who adores her charge sees no titles, no heraldry. In her arms, a prince is merely a sleepy boy with sticky fingers and an alarming capacity for drooling. Of course, the court couldn't stand for that sort of intimacy, so it invented boundaries. Some royal households ordered that once the child was weaned, the wet nurse must leave immediately, dismissed with gifts, money, or sometimes nothing at all. Others went further, forbidding the nurse from ever seeing the child again, as if affection were a contagious disease. Yet, in practice, those boundaries often failed spectacularly. Children, especially noble ones, remembered. They'd tug at skirts in hallways, asking for Nana, or demand her presence during fevers. And if they became monarchs one day, those same milk mothers occasionally returned, not as servants, but as trusted confidants. The chronicles are full of such tales, though they rarely name the women outright. One French duke supposedly refused to dine unless his old nurse sat beside him, to the horror of his courtiers. A Spanish princess, long married off abroad, secretly sent her former nurse gold coins every Easter. Even King Louis IX, St. Louis himself, was said to have visited his wet nurse's grave yearly, laying lilies upon it in silence. So much for emotional detachment. But then, affection in the Middle Ages was never simple. It was always layered, half duty, half defiance. The church said a woman's milk carried moral qualities, yet the same church preached divine compassion. The court prized loyalty, yet punished familiarity. And between those contradictions walked the wet nurse, balancing care with caution, love with fear. In the dark hours before dawn, she often whispered prayers over the child, not the formal Latin of the priests, but the quiet vernacular of her own heart. She might pray that he sleep, that his breath stay steady, that he grow kind. No chronicler ever recorded those words, but they lingered somehow, passed through time like the faint scent of lavender on old cloth. Sometimes, though, love had consequences. There are accounts, scandalous ones, of wet nurses accused of over-attachment. A nurse who lingered too long at a child's bedside could be suspected of manipulation. One who cried during separation might be accused of enchantment. After all, what was love but a form of magic in a world so eager to control it? The irony, of course, is that this forbidden affection often produced the best outcomes. Children raised by truly affectionate wet nurses tended to grow calmer, more sociable, more empathetic. Modern historians call this emotional stability. Medieval chroniclers, lacking the vocabulary, simply described such children as blessed with gentle humors. And so, night after night, the same impossible dance continues. She rocks the royal infant while the fire sinks low. She hums an old cradle song about home, about rivers, about mothers and the moon. The baby stirs, sighs, and sleeps again. You too feel that slow warmth spreading, the pull of drowsiness disguised as tenderness. You begin to understand why love, though feared, was the most potent magic of all. Because in this quiet corner of history, far from crowns and contracts, one woman's heartbeat holds an empire's air. Her care is unsanctioned, her devotion unrecorded. But it is real. It is the softest rebellion the world has ever known. By now, you've realized that the medieval nursery wasn't just about lullabies and linen. It was also, inevitably, about money. Everything in the castle was, from the price of a jeweled spoon to the cost of pretending a baby could inherit divine right. And when it came to wet nurses, that balance of affection and finance became especially interesting. Let's start with the simple truth. Good milk cost a fortune. A peasant woman might nurse her own child for free because, well, nature didn't send invoices. But when a noble or royal baby needed a wet nurse, the payments flowed like cream from a churn. Contracts from England, France, and the Italian states show wages that would make any medieval tradesman faint into his soup. A royal wet nurse could earn up to 10 times the salary of a castle cook, and sometimes as much as a lower-ranking knight. Add to that free lodging, clothing allowances, servants, and all the food she could sensibly consume, which, in fairness, was a lot. Breastfeeding burns calories, and medieval bread was basically endurance fuel. But the money was only the beginning. Because with payment came privilege, and privilege, as the Middle Ages proved time and again, was contagious. Many wet nurses were issued fine gowns to reflect their proximity to nobility. Soft wool, embroidered sleeves, sometimes even touches of silk. After all, appearances mattered. If a royal infant were to grow accustomed to luxury, even his caretaker's wardrobe had to whisper wealth. And so, our milk mother begins to look a little less like a servant and a little more like someone important. She walks through the corridors with confidence, nodding politely to knights, occasionally receiving half-bows from pages who know she feeds the future. She is not quite noble, but not quite common either. She lives in the warm, ambiguous middle ground that makes everyone else deeply uncomfortable. Naturally, the gossip starts almost immediately. "Did you see what she's wearing?" whispers one lady in waiting, clutching a lace kerchief in righteous dismay. "I heard she was given a brooch," says another. "Gold, from the Duchess herself." Someone else mutters that her meals are delivered directly from the royal kitchen. Someone else claims she has her own chambermaid. Someone else swears she was seen laughing with the steward. You see, in a place built entirely on hierarchy, any sign of comfort in the wrong hands looks like rebellion. And yet, the perks kept coming. Wealthy families often gifted their wet nurses silver spoons, jewels, or even plots of land as tokens of gratitude once their service was done. In Burgundy, one duke's nurse received a pension for life. In Aragon, another was granted a cottage near the monastery she favored. These were not tokens of politeness. They were testaments to how indispensable these women were. But of course, where there are rewards, there are resentments. Other servants began to murmur. How could it be fair that a simple milk giver earned more than a sword bearer, that she ate roasted capons while they dined on porridge? The castle hierarchy depended on invisible lines of respectability, and the wet nurse, bless her heart, had walked right through them, baby on hip. Even noble women occasionally bristled. After all, it's not easy to compete with someone who provides both comfort and calories to your child. There are recorded cases of duchesses and countesses arguing over how much jewelry or fabric was too much for a wet nurse to wear. It was less about fashion and more about power, the fear that affection and influence were being redistributed, one feeding at a time. But the perks weren't all visible. Some were subtle, emotional, even spiritual. A few wet nurses gained what historians now call milk kinship, a kind of honorary family tie recognized by both custom and canon law. Their children were sometimes treated as foster siblings to the noble baby they'd fed. This bond, milk brotherhood, could last for decades. There are medieval letters in which grown nobles refer to their wet nurses' sons as brothers in nurture, promising aid or inheritance. Imagine that, your child, born to a peasant household, suddenly linked by milk to a future duke. The church even treated milk kinship as sacred, refusing to marry people who had shared a wet nurse for fear it would violate spiritual incest taboos. Milk, it seemed, carried both nutrition and social consequences. Of course, not every wet nurse used her influence wisely. The annals of scandal are delightfully rich in stories of overindulgent nurses who enjoyed their position a bit too much. One Parisian nurse was dismissed for boastful behavior at market. Another was accused of selling off royal gifts for profit. And one unfortunate woman in the court of Naples was exiled entirely after being caught wearing her mistress's discarded gown to Sunday Mass. The horror. But even those downfalls reveal something telling. The wet nurse had power, however fleeting. She could attract envy, suspicion, and even the wrath of the nobility, all because she had what everyone else wanted: proximity. She was, quite literally, close to power's beating heart. You can almost picture her now, standing by a sunlit window, the royal infant asleep in her arms, the silk of her sleeve brushing against the carved cradle. She has eaten well, slept little, and been talked about endlessly. She has learned to smile carefully, to laugh quietly, to lower her eyes at the right moments. Her perks are real, but so are the risks. Because in the strange logic of the medieval court, affection raises you, and familiarity ruins you. One misstep, one rumor, one jealous noble, and the silk becomes sackcloth again. And yet, she stays. Not for money, not for gifts, but because there is a kind of pride in being the silent engine of a dynasty. Her hands may never touch a scepter, but her work is what allows it to be held. You, dear listener, start to feel the edges of drowsiness creep in as that realization settles. History, after all, is full of these quiet contradictions. A woman both powerful and powerless, rewarded and reviled, mother and servant. The castle murmurs in its sleep. Somewhere below, the cooks are preparing breakfast for people who believe they run the world. Upstairs, a nurse hums over a cradle, wealth and worry balanced in every note. The baby sighs, full and content. The candles sputter. And in that flickering light, you can almost see the truth. Kingdoms may be built by kings, but they are fed, quite literally, by women no one will ever remember. By now, you might think the wet nurse's world was confined to a single nursery, one cradle, one small sphere of influence. But that's the trick of castles. They look isolated, but they breathe through gossip. Every maid, every guard, every merchant who walks through the gates carries news like pollen, spreading stories from manor to manor. And so, somewhere between the flicker of candlelight and the clink of feeding cups, a remarkable network begins to take shape. The wet nurse underground, or, to put it less dramatically, the medieval mom club. Picture them gathered in a courtyard garden on a rare sunny afternoon. A cluster of women in linen gowns, sleeves rolled up, chatting quietly while their infants doze nearby in carved cradles or wicker baskets. There's laughter, a few sighs, maybe even some mild complaining about the steward's obsession with punctual feeding schedules. But don't be fooled. This is not idle chatter. This is information exchange, the 14th century version of a support group, crossed with a royal intelligence agency, because each woman here has seen things. She's overheard whispers in corridors, witnessed private moments between noble couples, or observed subtle shifts in household mood that even the courtiers miss. Wet nurses were, after all, the original witnesses to power in its pajamas. Some of these women served in castles, others in wealthy merchant homes, monasteries, or noble estates. A few came from other regions entirely, traveling great distances to find work. In places like France and Italy, wet nursing had become an organized trade, complete with agencies. Yes, medieval baby milk agencies, who matched clients with candidates, sometimes using letters of reference and character testimonials. One Venetian register even listed available wet nurses by neighborhood, describing their health, marital status, and disposition. You imagine some medieval clerk frowning over his quill, trying to rate good temper on a scale of 1 to 10. Through this semi-formal system, a kind of professional sisterhood emerged. Nurses who had worked for one noble family might recommend others. Households passed names along like secrets. The Count of Savoy's nurse is said to have an excellent supply. One letter reads, "Her cousin in Lyon seeks placement with a gentle household." In some ways, it was the first employment network run by women for women, and it gave rise to something that would terrify most medieval patriarchs: independence. These nurses, many of them widows or unmarried mothers, earned steady wages, managed their own lodgings, and negotiated terms. They were, in a sense, entrepreneurs of the body. Their commodity was care itself, distilled into sustenance. Of course, their clients never used such modern words. The nobles preferred to frame it as charity or divine duty. It sounded nobler that way. But beneath that veneer of sanctity, everyone understood the truth. A skilled wet nurse could command her price. And so, the network stretched across Europe, woven through gossip, letters, and reputation. A wet nurse dismissed from one castle might find another post within weeks, her reputation carried on the lips of traveling merchants or clerics. Some even moved across borders, crossing from France to Flanders, from Aragon to Naples, milk contracts tucked carefully among their belongings. There are surviving records of wet nurses who kept correspondence with one another for years, exchanging updates on the children they'd raised. "My little lord now rides a pony," writes one. "Yours, I hear, has begun his Latin." They celebrated milestones that their noble employers rarely bothered to notice. And though they'd never call themselves scholars, they traded practical knowledge too. Recipes for soothing colicky babies, herbal teas to restore milk flow, prayers against fevers. One 15th century midwife's manual even includes marginal notes, handwritten by what appear to be wet nurses, correcting the author's advice. "This herb does not aid the milk, but causes pain," one scrawled in the corner, adding, "Try fennel water instead." You start to imagine the sound of it, a low murmur of shared wisdom, laughter rising like steam over cups of watered wine, the clink of spoons, the rustle of linen, a quiet rebellion of competence. Naturally, not everyone approved. Clergy complained that these women formed idle assemblies. Stewards grumbled that too much talking led to lax discipline. One chronicler, clearly scandalized, accused them of spreading feminine superstition, which, in medieval male speak, usually meant accurate folk medicine that worked better than ours. Still, they gathered, in courtyards and kitchens under olive trees at wells. They swapped gossip about royal births, debated which noble households were kind or cruel, and even, occasionally, mocked their employers. You can almost hear one of them saying, "His lordship fears milk fever, yet drinks wine until dawn." The others laugh, not loudly, but with the shared relief of those who see absurdity and survive it. Over time, these informal circles took on something larger than camaraderie. They became a whispering network of female power, not political in the way of dukes and bishops, but social, emotional, practical. When one nurse fell ill, another stepped in. When a contract soured, someone knew a safer household. It's an invisible infrastructure history rarely mentions, but it kept the whole fragile world of noble infancy functioning. Behind every well-fed prince or princess stood not just one woman, but dozens, advisors, replacements, friends. And somewhere between those layers of loyalty and laughter, you realize that what you're hearing isn't just gossip, it's legacy. These women were custodians of continuity, passing down rituals of care that stretched back generations. Even the language reflected it. In France, the term bala, wet nurse, came to signify both the person and the act of nurturing. In Italy, balia implied a blend of physical and moral guardianship. It was less about milk and more about meaning: to hold, to guide, to sustain. And in the hush of that realization, you find yourself smiling. Because amid the rigidity of medieval class systems, this sisterhood managed to create something rare, an informal community based not on blood or title, but on shared exhaustion, humor, and compassion. You can almost see it. The flicker of torches fading as the courtyard empties, the soft sound of sandals on stone, the night settling over the castle like a wool blanket. Each woman returns to her chamber, to her cradle, to her waiting charge. And as she hums her lullaby, she carries with her the collective wisdom of all who came before. History may have forgotten their names, but their network hums quietly beneath the noise of kings and queens. A gentle, resilient pulse, like the steady rhythm of a mother's heartbeat in the dark. By candlelight, a wet nurse's job might look like simple biology, a matter of supply and demand. But beneath the milk and muslin swirled a medieval soup of superstition, the kind that could turn any mother's bedtime into a theological crisis. You see, In the Middle Ages, milk wasn't just a bodily fluid. It was cosmic material, a liquid extension of the soul. To the medieval mind, milk was distilled blood, transmuted through purity and virtue. That meant, if your wet nurse was greedy, lazy, or heaven forbid, sinful, her milk might carry moral corruption straight into your infant's veins. Imagine the anxiety of noble parents. You've just paid a small fortune to hire a nurse from some reputable agency in Avignon, and now your local priest warns you she might accidentally baptize your baby in heresy through her breakfast. This fear was serious enough that moral purity clauses were built into wet nurse contracts. Some required the nurse to abstain from sex for the entire duration of service, partly to keep her milk pure, but mostly to ensure she wasn't distracted. Others banned her from eating certain foods: onions, garlic, rabbit, eel, all believed to thicken or sour the milk. One French physician's manual from 1380 confidently advised, "Let her not eat cabbage, nor lentils, nor anything that grows in the shadow, for such foods burden the humor of milk." That same author also recommended keeping a wet nurse cheerful, because melancholy breeds thinness of milk. Translation: cranky women make watery milk. You can't help but chuckle. The medieval obsession with vibes was astonishing. A nurse's emotional weather was believed to flavor her milk. Jealousy made it sharp, grief made it gray, lust made it too hot. So, noble households began tracking their nurses' moods like medieval wellness apps. Did she seem content today? Did she pray long enough at matins? Was her laughter too loud, or her silence too deep? Everything was data for the anxious upper class, convinced the fate of the next generation depended on the emotional stability of one tired woman and her breakfast. And yet, superstition ran even deeper. Across Christendom, you'll find whispers of milk magic, charms to increase supply, blessings to prevent evil eyes, and prayers against cursed breasts. In parts of England, women tied silver coins into ribbons around their wrists to keep the milk from running away. In rural France, some sprinkled holy water over their chests while reciting Psalm 23. In Italy, they'd draw protective circles on their milk jugs with chalk before each feeding, muttering, "Come pure, stay pure, go pure." If the milk failed to flow, a disaster for any wet nurse, neighbors would blame witches. The accusation usually went something like, "She gave me the evil glance while stirring her pot, and my milk dried up the next morning." In some regions, this fear spawned bizarre rituals. One 15th century English text advises mothers to pour their first morning's milk onto the doorstep, that witches may take their share and not steal the rest. You can almost picture medieval women performing this odd little truce at dawn, while the rest of the house snored on. Of course, scholars tried to rationalize it all. Learned men like Albertus Magnus and Avicenna offered intricate theories about milk's temperament. Avicenna classified milk under the warm and moist humoral category, meaning too much melancholy, cold and dry, and the nurse could spoil it. The solution? Light exercise, warm baths, and good conversation. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? Even in a world ruled by superstition, someone was still prescribing long walks and self-care. But not everyone took the high road. Some nobles, especially the anxious or eccentric ones, went further, hiring astrologers to determine the best days for nursing sessions. Yes, you read that right. Somewhere in Burgundy, a damp-eyed astrologer with ink-stained fingers was checking planetary alignments before declaring, "Today, Mars opposes Venus. Do not feed after Vespers." Astrological manuals of the time warned against nursing under certain moon phases, especially waning ones. Milk drawn under the dark moon, one wrote, will bring weakness of spirit. And so, household schedules warped around the stars. Imagine the confusion of a bleary-eyed nurse at 3 a.m., whispering, "But the baby's hungry now," only to be told, "Wait, Venus must rise first." Some nobles even commissioned talismans to safeguard the nursing process. Small pendants carved with figures of the Virgin Mary or Saint Agatha, the patron saint of nurses and breasts, were tied to cradles. Tiny bones of holy mothers, saints or even dried animal relics, were tucked into linen pouches beneath pillows. Saint Agatha's story was especially resonant. She'd been tortured by having her breasts cut off, only to have them miraculously restored by divine grace. So naturally, she became the spiritual insurance policy for every woman whose livelihood depended on milk. In fact, medieval art often depicts Saint Agatha holding a platter with her detached breasts on it, looking quite composed, as if to say, "I've seen worse." Many wet nurses prayed to her before feeding time, crossing themselves over their chests and whispering, "Saint Agatha, keep this milk clean and let no evil cross its stream." Even more curious were the folk remedies passed between nurses themselves. In one German manuscript, a note in the margin reads, "If the milk falters, drink the broth of fennel, honey, and wine. Then say thrice, 'Flow as Christ's mercy flows.'" It's strange and sweet at once, science and superstition braided together like a lullaby. Some of these rituals were tender, even empowering. Others, frankly, were ridiculous. But all shared one purpose: to make sense of an unpredictable world where infant survival teetered on the edge of mystery. After all, in an age without germ theory, superstition filled the gaps. When a baby thrived, it proved divine favor. When one fell ill, it was easier, perhaps kinder, to blame a star, a spell, or a sour humor than to face the randomness of mortality. And so, every feeding carried a whisper of ceremony. Every burp and sigh felt like part of some grand cosmic rhythm, as though the milk itself were a bridge between heaven and hearth. You imagine it now. The nurse by the fire, the baby at her breast, the flicker of shadows on stone walls, a charm bracelet clinking softly as she moves. She hums under her breath, part prayer, part lullaby, and the night listens. Whether she's invoking saints, stars, or science doesn't really matter. The result is the same: a moment of peace in a world obsessed with chaos. And in that quiet, you realize why these superstitions lasted. They weren't foolishness. They were comfort, disguised as ritual. The milk might curdle, the stars might fade, but for one gentle hour the world made sense again. You might think the church would have had better things to worry about: plagues, heresies, the occasional Viking relapse. But no. By the 12th century, Europe's most learned men had developed a full-blown theological fixation with milk. Not wine, not relics, not even the 7 deadly sins. Milk. Because if there was one thing medieval clergy loved more than saving souls, it was regulating bodies, especially women's bodies. And the wet nurse, with her peculiar mix of holiness and hired labor, sat right at the crossroads of moral panic. Let's start with the basic premise. Milk was moral. According to most medieval theologians, milk wasn't just nourishment. It was virtue in liquid form. They believed it was purified blood, transformed by divine grace into something fit for infants, which sounded very poetic until someone pointed out the obvious problem. If milk came from blood, and when blood reflected the soul, then a wet nurse's moral state might, by extension, leak into her milk. You can already see where this is going. If the wet nurse had unholy thoughts, her milk might carry spiritual corruption. If she had an argument with her husband, the baby might inherit a temper. If she skipped confession, heaven forbid, the child's faith could turn lukewarm. This was the kind of theological algebra that kept bishops awake at night. By the 13th century, scholars like Thomas of Chobham were writing entire treatises on whether a child could imbibe vice through the nurse's humors. He wasn't alone. Dominican preachers lectured that the breast was a vessel of moral contagion. Augustine's followers took it further, suggesting that wet nurses should undergo confession before nursing, just to make sure no trace of sin entered the child through their veins. Imagine being a wet nurse at Mass and hearing that sermon. You're just trying to do your job, and suddenly Father Bernard is implying your milk might spawn heresy. One anonymous sermon from Burgundy, circa 1420, warned noble families. Choose not the nurse who lies or loves the tavern, for her milk is clouded by sin. The infant that suckles her will grow in deceit and gluttony. Yes, gluttony. Apparently, one too many cheese pies could doom the next generation. The church even tried to regulate who could nurse whom. A few bishops' councils ruled that infants of Christian households must only be fed by baptized women. A noble child suckled by a pagan, or even a recently converted Jew or Muslim, was thought to risk spiritual contamination. So, contracts began including clauses that sound less like childcare policies and more like exorcism prerequisites. She shall be a woman of good fame, baptized, chaste, and without stain of heresy. One can almost hear the priest muttering as he dips his quill. Let's add another, without stain. You can't be too careful with milk. But the clergy didn't stop at background checks. Some theologians went into great anatomical detail, because, as we've established, medieval scholars were nothing if not thorough in their absurdity. A 14th century monk named Bartholomeus Anglicus described in his encyclopedic De Proprietatibus Rerum how milk was created by divine chemistry, blood purified in the heart, filtered through virtue, and expressed through grace. Thus, he wrote solemnly, if sin dwell in the heart, the milk is tainted. One has to admire the confidence of men who'd never lactated, but felt perfectly qualified to explain it to everyone else. And then there were the sermons. Oh, the sermons. Priests loved milk metaphors. They compared divine mercy to milk, sweet and nourishing to babes in faith, Christ's teaching to milk, simple for those not ready for meat, and the Virgin Mary's motherhood to celestial lactation. In fact, one popular devotional image, the lactation of Saint Bernard, depicts the Virgin Mary squirting a stream of milk into Bernard of Clairvaux's mouth as a symbol of divine wisdom. Yes, seriously, you can still find frescoes of it in Spanish monasteries. The monks must have had a field day explaining that one. So while preachers thundered about sin and purity, artists were busy painting holy lactation scenes all over Europe. The message was confusing, to say the least. The paradox was this: milk was sacred when it flowed from Mary, but suspicious when it came from Margaret. The Virgin's milk could save souls, but the village nurses might endanger them. Still, the clergy couldn't resist meddling. Some even proposed moral training programs for wet nurses, early versions of ethics workshops, if you will. They advised them to pray before each feeding, to meditate on chastity, and to sing hymns instead of lullabies. because nothing soothes a fussy infant like a dirge about eternal damnation. Others preached against wet nurse idolatry. They warned noble mothers not to love their nurses too much or elevate them socially. In one sermon, a priest lamented that ladies cling more to the nurse than to God and honor her breasts as relics. It was, perhaps, a backhanded compliment. Wet nurses held real emotional power in the nursery, a bond no priest could touch. The clergy could write all the sermons they liked, but when the baby cried at midnight, it wasn't the priest who came running. And maybe that's what truly unsettled them, the quiet, daily holiness of women who didn't need theological validation to do sacred work. A few more open-minded clerics saw it differently. The Franciscan theologian Bonaventure, for example, wrote that a good nurse is an instrument of divine providence, for through her, life is sustained. He even suggested that nursing was a form of prayer. That rare mercy gave weary women something to cling to, that their work, humble and bodily as it was, had heaven's blessing. But still, the fear lingered. Well into the Renaissance, theologians debated milk like sommeliers analyzing vintages. They argued over whether virtue travels through nourishment and whether spiritual corruption could theoretically be digested. Even Martin Luther got dragged into it. He used the metaphor of pure milk of faith so often that later reformers jokingly called him God's wet nurse. Though, given his temperament, one suspects the babies wouldn't have lasted long. Through all this moral turbulence, the wet nurses themselves kept doing what they always had, feeding the next generation, sermon or no sermon. You imagine them now, listening from the back of the church as the priest thunders about milk and sin. Maybe one yawns, maybe another stifles a laugh, because deep down, they know something he doesn't. That purity can't be preached. It's practiced, quietly, in the dark hours between midnight and dawn, when all the sermons in the world mean nothing compared to a full belly and a sleeping child. And when the priest finally winds down, clutching his parchment in moral panic, the wet nurse steps outside, breathes the cool air, and returns to the nursery. She sits, hums softly, and does the work of saints. By the time a royal or noble infant reached the tender age of 2, he or she had more mothers than you have unopened browser tabs. There was the real mother, the one who produced the air, and ideally did not die in childbirth. There was the milk mother, the wet nurse whose body had sustained the baby for its first critical months. There was the dry nurse or nanny, who took over once solid food began. Then came the governess, who handled the small human's transition from cradle to court. And hovering somewhere nearby was usually a backup wet nurse, because medieval households trusted nature about as much as they trusted plumbing. What emerges from all this is not one mother, but a miniature ecosystem of motherhood, layered like a feudal bureaucracy of affection. Each woman occupied her own rung in the hierarchy. The noble mother, usually a duchess, countess, or queen, held the title and the bloodline. Her job was political, to produce heirs, not to burp them. Nursing, in her eyes, was a duty better delegated. A woman of rank was expected to get back to diplomacy, ceremony, or the delicate business of avoiding court scandals. The wet nurse, meanwhile, held the baby's heart. For the first 2 years of life, she was its world, the warmth, the heartbeat, the comfort. To the infant, she wasn't an employee, but the universe itself. The irony was cruel. The person with the least social power often had the deepest emotional bond, and that bond was dangerous. You see, noble mothers were not supposed to get jealous, but they often did. Letters and diaries hint at quiet heartbreak. A few queens wrote with surprising vulnerability about feeling replaced by their child's nurse. "He clings to her as if I were a stranger," confessed one Italian noblewoman in 1470. "She has stolen his first smile from me." But jealousy didn't only flow upward. Wet nurses, too, felt possessive. Many referred to their charges as my son or my little one, even years after they'd left service. They sent letters, gifts, prayers. One French nurse reportedly wept when told she could not attend her grown nursling's wedding. "For had I not given him the milk of my body," she wrote, "you begin to see the tragic comedy of it all. Too much love, divided by protocol." When the child was weaned, the household hierarchy shifted again. Enter the nanny, or dry nurse. She was often older, experienced, and tougher, a veteran of many cradles. Her role was to shepherd the toddler into early childhood, teaching manners, monitoring sleep, and making sure the heir didn't swallow a gemstone or wander into the moat. Next came the governess, the intellectual stepmother of the bunch. She was usually literate, sometimes even scholarly, and charged with the monumental task of shaping the child's mind. Her tools were parchment, patience, and a perpetual air of gentle disapproval. So, by the time a little duke or princess toddled across the nursery floor, there were at least 4 women watching, each with her own stake in that child's soul. The competition could get fierce. Chronicles and household letters described subtle rivalries, nurses feuding over who the baby smiled at first, or who could soothe it fastest. The governess might complain that the nanny spoiled the child. The nanny might mutter that the governess filled its head with too much Latin and too few naps. Behind the lace and courtesy, it was a quiet war of influence, waged with lullabies and bedtime routines. And in the center of it all was a confused toddler, patted, praised, and disciplined by an entire parliament of mothers. Some children grew up deeply affectionate, used to comfort and care. Others learned manipulation early, mastering the art of playing their caregivers against one another. He cried for his nurse until she returned, then refused her embrace, wrote one exhausted governess in the court of Burgundy. He knows his power already. But affection, however complicated, left a mark. Many grown nobles remembered their wet nurses with tenderness long after childhood. Kings and dukes often provided pensions or dowries for their milk mothers. Henry III of England, for instance, granted his wet nurse lands and lifelong income. Louis IX of France, later St. Louis, continued to visit his nurse into adulthood, calling her "my second mother." The affection could blur boundaries in unexpected ways. A nurse's biological children sometimes benefited from her connection to noble offspring, receiving positions as pages, ladies-in-waiting, or clerks. The phrase milk brother or milk sister wasn't just sentimental. It could carry real social weight. 2 people raised at the same breast were bound by quasi-familial loyalty, sometimes stronger than blood. In medieval law and custom, this bond even created taboos. In many regions, milk kin were forbidden to marry, as their shared nourishment made them spiritual siblings. Imagine the genealogical chaos that caused among the nobility. Half the kingdom suddenly off limits for romantic alliances because of shared feeding histories. Yet, despite the tenderness and taboo, the system was undeniably transactional. The moment a child was weaned, the wet nurse's emotional value evaporated faster than a forgotten cup of milk. Weaning usually happened around age 2 or 3, marked by what one English noblewoman called the Great Parting. The nurse might receive gifts, rings, dresses, sometimes even livestock, as farewell tokens. But once she left the castle, the child often forgot her within weeks. New caregivers filled the void. The noble mother, by then, stepped back in for portraits and pageants, reclaiming her symbolic role as mater familias. And the cycle began again. Still, there were exceptions. Rare but luminous. A few noble families kept their nurses close, inviting them to live out their days as trusted companions. In some cases, these women became unofficial advisors, drawing on their lifelong intimacy with their noble children. One chronicler tells of a duchess who trusted no counsel, save that of her nurse, who had suckled her in infancy and chastised her in youth. It's oddly touching. The idea that a woman once hired for her milk could one day wield quiet political influence simply because she'd known a powerful person before they learned to walk. So, when you picture a medieval nursery, don't imagine just one cradle and one mother. Picture an entire constellation of caregivers, each orbiting the same small sun, each trying to shape a fragment of its future. The noble child, meanwhile, grows surrounded by warmth and watchfulness. Every need met, every tear tended. But in that abundance lies the seed of something melancholy, the knowledge that love, in the world of nobility, was rarely singular. It came divided, professionalized, and, at the end of the day, paid by the month. Still, amid the hierarchy and ceremony, affection bloomed in strange corners. A nurse's song hummed through generations, echoing faintly even in royal halls. And perhaps, late at night, when the adult nobles stared into a fire after a long day of statecraft, they sometimes heard that old melody again, simple, tender, half forgotten, and remembered the woman who once held the world steady in her arms. It begins with a cough. Not the delicate poetic sort that belongs in a troubadour's lament, but a small, raspy hiccup from the royal cradle. You are half asleep in your embroidered chair, a goblet of thin wine cooling beside you, when the nursemaid rushes in, eyes wide as chapel bells. The baby, the precious heir to an entire kingdom's future, is ill. Now, illness in medieval nurseries is as common as fleas on a tapestry dog. But when the baby in question has titles longer than most prayers, every sniffle becomes a political crisis. You rise, heart thudding like a badly tuned lute, and cross the rush-strewn floor toward the cradle. The wet nurse, pale, trembling, her cap slightly askew, has already begun the ritual of panic, clutching the child, praying aloud, promising she followed every dietary rule in her contract. Because you remember that contract, don't you? The ink, the seals, the solemn witnesses, the clause that said she must never, ever, under any circumstances, feed the child anything but her own milk. And the other clause, the one about liability in the case of divine punishment, witchcraft, or gross negligence. It's starting to look uncomfortably relevant. By morning, word of the infant's condition has spread beyond the nursery. The steward mutters about evil vapors. The cook insists someone's been burning the wrong herbs. The chaplain suggests fasting and prayer, while your physician, who believes in leeches the way poets believe in love, produces a jar full of something alive and wriggling. And then, inevitably, someone mentions witchcraft. It's always witchcraft, isn't it? If the milk curdled, it was a curse. If the baby cried at the wrong hour, it was demonic influence. If the nurse's hair was too red, her eyes too knowing, her milk too plentiful, well, clearly she had made a pact with the devil in exchange for supernatural lactation. The logic is watertight if you ignore the fact that it makes absolutely no sense. Soon, the castle hums with whispers. The laundress swears she saw the wet nurse talking to a cat. The The scullion claims he heard her humming in Latin. The clerk of accounts, who once fancied her, decides this is a fine moment to mention she once refused his advances, proof, surely, of satanic pride. You, bleary-eyed and exhausted, find yourself conducting an impromptu inquisition while trying to keep the baby breathing. Somewhere, a monk is called to test the milk. He performs an elaborate ritual involving a candle flame and a bowl of holy water. If the milk sinks, it's pure. If it floats, it's cursed. Science at its finest. You try to recall what the last scandal was. Ah, yes, the Duchess of Cornwall's wet nurse who was accused of slipping poppy juice into the cradle to make the baby sleep longer. That case ended with a public confession, a fine, and a lifetime ban on attending baptisms. This time, however, the stakes feel higher. This is your child. At court, illness in an infant is not just a personal tragedy. It's a diplomatic incident. If the baby dies, alliances crumble. If the baby recovers, someone will take credit. And if the wet nurse is blamed, well, she might not survive to see another dawn. You summon the royal physician again, who now insists the problem lies not with the milk, but with corrupt air. He prescribes fumigation, burning rosemary, sage, and something suspiciously like dried bat wings. The room fills with smoke so thick you can't see your own shoes. The baby coughs harder. The nurse faints. The chaplain declares it progress. By nightfall, you've learned more about medieval childcare panic than you ever wanted to know. The steward demands the wet nurse be replaced for safety. The clerk is already drafting her dismissal. The baby, mercifully, falls asleep. You stand over the cradle, watching the rise and fall of that tiny chest, and realize that beneath the pomp and politics, you are simply terrified. Terrified that something so small, so royal, and so utterly dependent could be lost in a single night. When dawn breaks, the crisis has softened. The fever has broken. The baby's cheeks are flushed with life again, and the wet nurse, pale but resolute, resumes her post. The castle exhales in collective relief. The steward claims his fumigations worked. The chaplain claims his prayers did. The physician insists it was his leeches. No one credits the woman who simply stayed awake, feeding the child every hour, whispering comfort into the dark. Still, the scandal will linger. A faint stain on her reputation, a warning to future nurses to tread carefully between care and culpability. The chronicles will omit her name, but they will mention the illness of the young heir and the swift and righteous action taken by the household. And as you look at her across the nursery, the quiet strength in her eyes, the way she hums as the baby sleeps, you wonder how many of these women have stood in this same place, carrying the weight of both life and blame in their arms. History rarely remembers the ones who saved children. It prefers the ones who accused them. The baby grows teeth. That's the first sign that your wet nurse's service is nearing its end. A few sharp little pearls appear, where once there was only gum and gurgle, and suddenly, the royal nursery is a place of wary fingers and bitten knuckles. The court physician announces the child is ready to be weaned, delivering the verdict as though he himself invented teeth, and you watch the wet nurse's expression change ever so slightly. It's the look of someone who knows she is about to become unnecessary. For months, perhaps years, she has been the heartbeat of the nursery. Her arms have cradled the kingdom's future. Her milk has nourished a bloodline older than most churches. And now, with the slow inevitability of all medieval endings, her chapter is closing. But what happens to a wet nurse after the baby no longer needs her? If she is lucky, and luck is a rare coin in this age. She will be rewarded handsomely. You might grant her a small pension, a cottage near the orchard, and a lifetime supply of good wool. Some noble families, especially those who secretly adored their nurses, gave them jewelry or even small plots of land. A few became governesses, staying on to guide their milk children through teething, tantrums, and the trials of royal adolescence. Others, less fortunate, were dismissed with little ceremony, a purse of coins, a signed paper, and a perfunctory, "God keep you." Their role, once sacred, intimate, vital, vanishes overnight, swallowed by the churn of court life. Within a week, the new governess takes over, and the baby begins the slow process of forgetting the scent and warmth of the woman who once was his world. Still, the bond between them lingers, even when memory fades. Some royal children, especially the tender-hearted ones who hadn't yet learned that affection is political, would seek out their old wet nurses years later. Chronicles tell of princes who called their former nurses mother, of queens who secretly sent gifts to aging women in distant villages, of dukes who knelt in tears at funerals for the only person who'd ever held them without calculation. You hear of one such woman, Eleonora, once nurse to a minor English prince. When her charge became king, he summoned her to court, dressed her in silk, and made her sit beside him at feast. Chroniclers found it strange, even improper, but he said simply, "She was the first to love me, without wanting anything." Not all stories end so tenderly. For every Eleonora, there were dozens of nameless women cast out the moment the cradle emptied. Some were accused of lingering too long, of presuming upon their closeness. Others found themselves replaced, not by a governess, but by another baby, from another noble house, another contract, another cycle of borrowed intimacy. Their lives became a quiet chain of milk and departure, each child another heartbeat briefly shared, each farewell another small death. In rare cases, a wet nurse's career took her upward, into politics and influence. The royal milk mother of France's Louis XIII, for instance, became a figure of almost mythic devotion. Her descendants were ennobled, her family lifted from peasantry to prestige. Even in Spain and the Italian courts, noble children often grew up referring to their nurses' kin as hermanos de leche, milk brothers, implying a bond nearly as sacred as blood. But behind the titles and tales lies a quieter truth. These women inhabited a liminal space between family and servant, holiness and utility. They were indispensable, yet disposable, revered, yet replaceable. And as they aged, many found themselves haunted by phantom cries and the ache of empty arms. Some took in orphans. Some turned to midwifery, unable to let go of the rhythms of care. A few entered convents, offering their service to God instead of kings. The church, of course, had opinions about all of this. It always did. Bishops praised devoted nurses as living symbols of Christian charity, then scolded them for vanity if they dressed too well. Priests preached that nursing another's child was a holy labor of the flesh, but only if done humbly. Even after retirement, a wet nurse's virtue remained under watch, as though purity could spoil like milk left by the hearth. And yet, imagine her years later, in her cottage, her hair silvering under a linen veil. Perhaps she still hums the lullabies she once sang to a royal infant, songs about sparrows and moonlight and the promise of morning. Perhaps she tells her grandchildren that once she held a prince in her arms, not out of pride, but because it feels too dreamlike to be real. You picture her walking through the fields on a soft spring evening, gathering herbs for supper. The wind smells of hay and river mist. Somewhere, church bells ring the hour. She pauses, looks toward the distant towers of the castle, and wonders whether the child she once nursed still remembers her name. History may not, but milk has a memory of its own. It lingers in bone, in the very marrow of kings, long after the ink on royal contracts has faded. Centuries pass, and the nursery walls crumble. The tapestries that once muffled the royal baby's cries have long turned to dust. The scrolls that recorded every feeding, every fever, every scandal. They sleep now in archives, their ink faded to the color of dried leaves. And yet, somewhere in those forgotten margins, the wet nurses remain. You can still trace their presence if you know where to look. A royal account book with an oddly generous pension noted beside a woman's name. A christening record where a noble child's godmother is listed as the nurse in gratitude. A letter from a grown prince to a country widow, sealed with words too tender for politics. They flicker through history like candlelight, small, human, and stubbornly warm. You imagine walking through an old castle, long since turned into a museum. The nursery wing is quiet now, its cradle staged behind velvet ropes. A placard explains that noble infants were commonly suckled by hired women of good repute. Such a sterile phrase for something so intimate, so alive. The air smells faintly of beeswax and cold stone, but if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The soft hum of lullabies, the rhythmic heartbeat of centuries-long care. And if you listen closer, beneath the dust and display glass, you might sense the layers of milk lines running through history. The French nourrices, the English milk mothers, the Spanish amas de cría, all bound by a strange, tender fraternity of nourishment. Their work transcended bloodlines, weaving commoners and nobles together in ways that politics never could. A child fed by a peasant woman might grow into a king who unknowingly shares her temperament, her patience, perhaps even her rhythm of speech. Some chroniclers claimed it was nonsense, that blood ruled all, not milk, but others, especially the quietly observant, noticed the uncanny echoes. The soft-hearted kings, the calm queens, the occasional noble who preferred the company of shepherds to courtiers. Traits that might have trickled down not through royal veins, but through the milk of someone kind and unseen. You think about that all of history's pageantry might have been subtly shaped by the hands and hearts of those who were never meant to matter. A wet nurse in Florence in 1472 sings to a baby who will grow into a Medici patron. A woman in Burgundy rocks a future duchess while dreaming of her own children back home. A Moorish nurse in Granada whispers Arabic blessings over a Christian infant before the fall of the Alhambra. Their names vanish from record, but their touch echoes through cathedrals, treaties, portraits, and wars. Even the scholars, centuries later, can't agree where to file them. Were they servants, mothers, instruments of empire, saints of the domestic sphere? Each historian bends over the same parchment, puzzled by the contradiction. How something so physical, so earthy, milk, could shape something as abstract as monarchy. And you, listening here in the gentle quiet, might feel a faint stirring of that same paradox, because the story of noble wet nurses is really the story of invisible inheritance, the unrecorded labor that builds kingdoms, sustains dynasties, and softens even the hardest lineage with the quiet strength of care. If you follow that thread long enough, it leads past the nursery door, past the castle walls, past time itself, It leads to every night where someone stayed awake while another slept. Every whisper, every steady breath, every heartbeat offered to another. That's the legacy the archives can't capture. You picture, in the dim light of your imagination, all those nurses gathered together somewhere beyond history, sitting in a great meadow under a sky that never darkens, cradling the generations they once fed. They smile, not with pride, but with peace, knowing that in some small, secret way, they raised the world. And as you drift further into stillness, it's easy to forget where you end and where their story begins, because you too are part of that long continuum of comfort and care, the quiet legacy of those who keep watch, who give warmth, who pass on calm through simple acts of nurture. The milk lines never ended. They only changed form. The castle fades now, stone melting into mist, the rushes on the floor softening into clouds. You're no longer a noble parent, nor a wet nurse, nor even a watcher at the cradle of history. You're just still, floating in the hush between heartbeat and dream. The sound of the nursery lingers, but gentler now. A crackling fire, the faint creak of a rocking chair, the whisper of wool skirts brushing against flagstones. Someone hums, a tune with no words, only the rise and fall of comfort. It could be the same song sung 1,000 years ago to a royal child, or to no one in particular at all. Outside, the moon hangs over the quiet fields, silvering the rooftops where once the wet nurses walked home with their shawls drawn close. The air smells of milk and rosemary, of hearth smoke and night rain. In the distance, a bell tolls the hour, but it feels soft, almost drowsy, like it too has grown tired of being awake. You breathe in, slow, then out. The story rests now, its parchment closed, its ink drying in the dark. The women who lived it, those milk mothers, those quiet keepers of dynasties, have all gone to sleep long ago. But their calm lingers, settling over you like a blanket spun from centuries of rest. In this moment, you are part of their endless lullaby. You are the hush after the last cry, the warmth after the storm, the peace that comes when everything unnecessary finally lets go. The cradle rocks once more in your mind, steady as breath. History exhales, and somewhere in the gentle dark of your imagination, a soft voice murmurs, "You've done enough for today. Sleep now."